What's up everybody, welcome back to the channel and to another Outriders video. Today we're looking at a Pyromancer build and one of my favorite skills in the game, Phaser. If you're looking for something that hits incredibly hard and is able to one-tap almost everything in the game, then this is definitely the build for you. If you enjoyed the video or found it useful in any way, please do consider giving it a like, subbing to the channel, maybe sharing the video with a buddy. It really does help the channel grow and it just means a whole lot to me. But without any further ado, let's go. As mentioned, this is a Pyromancer build focusing around the skill Phaser, and specifically this incorporates, I guess, what we can call the reload or the volcanic reload meta, which is something which is very popular to be used by Pyromancers right now, and also something which can be found in some of the videos on my channel. And this of course revolves around not actually using volcanic rounds for the actual shooting of it, but rather the reloading and then getting the reload buff that you get from the mod on volcanic rounds, which increases your anomaly damage by 50%. Now, Phaser by itself deals quite a bit of damage as usual, and there are several other mechanics in the game and mods in the game that you can use to ramp this damage up. But this additional 50% just really pushes it over the top, and this is what I mean when I say that you can literally one-tap almost everything in the game. One of the things that I also enjoy about this build is that it's kind of different to the usual way in which Pyromancers are played, and that is that they're powerhouses in doing AoE damage across everything. So definitely your AoE damage suffers a little bit because this doesn't use Ash Blast or Overheat, but rather switches to more of a focused beam that essentially is really good at dealing a lot of damage in a single area. Does that mean that you're going to struggle taking down trash and cleaning up the expedition? No, not at all. That's not what I'm saying. And especially due to the fact that you have really low cooldowns and the way how Phaser can essentially stretch almost across the entire map, you can set up these firing lanes where you can have Phaser essentially hit everybody in that line, killing them all in one shot. Now, while the footage that you're looking in the background is me playing solo, I'd say one of the strengths of this build is definitely the fact that you can translate very easily into co-op play as well. Now, the mod choice that I have today and that we're going to look at allows you to survive better in solo. But if you go into a co-op situation, you can peel some of those mods off, one or two of them, and really embrace the glass cannon life. And so therefore your teammates will be taking care of the AoE duties and essentially taking the attention of the enemies, and you can be this artillery piece in the background just hitting these big fat phasers and essentially killing almost everything with one hit. From a rotation perspective, this is very much similar to something that we would see in an Ash Blast Overheat situation, and that is that there's a part of the fight or a part of the rotation where you're essentially stacking debuffs or stacking boosts to your damage, and then your Phaser beam is essentially the offload. Now, the additional step in here is the inclusion of volcanic rounds, which wasn't around before, and now due to the fact of it being so popular and also so damn powerful, this is an additional step that you need to bring in, but really easy once you get a little bit of practice in. And this is by no means a difficult class to play, and you can get these big chunky hits quite easily once you get a couple of rounds in with it and once you realize the sequence in which you need to activate your skills and use your weapons. Lastly, I would say that, and this is probably something that makes a certain group of viewers of builds and of my channel very happy, this is a build that does not lean on the Moaning Winds meta or any kind of swap mechanic. Yes, you are swapping your weapons to get the reload boost from volcanic rounds, but you're essentially fighting almost at long range all the time, and it's definitely to your benefit to keep as much distance as possible between you and the enemies, because it allows you to focus a more concentrated blast of Phaser and get as many enemies at once. But now let's look at the gear. Now, leaving the transmog aside, this uses 3-piece Akari simply due to the fact that we are employing Heat Wave, and Heat Wave is one of our ramp up mechanics, and so you'd be silly not to use Akari. So unfortunately, if you don't have Akari, you can absolutely build this, and there is a 5 epic piece version of this build that I've also been tinkering with, which I might bring to the channel as well. But definitely, if you use Akari, it's just gonna make the phasers hit that much harder. And actually, the funny thing is, a lot of your damage is gonna come from really powerful heat waves as well. Now, when it comes to the weapon, as I mentioned, we're not using Moaning Winds meta or anything like that. What I in actual fact have is I have 2 weapons that have Fortress on them. First of all, I have Death Shield with Fortress on and Shadow Comet. And then secondly, I have Shalrog's Excrescience. Jesus, I hope I'm saying that right. With ultimate burning bullets and fortress on. The reason for this is, and how I play this, and what you would have seen from the footage earlier, is that I essentially use one gun until the volcanic rounds is ready to go. Then I activate that, I switch to the next gun, and I use that weapon. The other reason why Shalrogs works really well for me is because a lot of my damage also is increased against burning or things that have burn on them. So having a gun that you can readily apply this with is pretty cool as well, for cases where, for instance, your heat wave might be on cooldown or you might not be in melee range. But then the other thing as well is that since we're using phaser, and phaser stacks off of how much status power you stack on your gear, having a gun that has status power on it is pretty good as well. I experimented with a bunch of different things like the wicker and so on, and also experimented with trying to make the build be more focused against dealing more damage against ashen enemies instead of burning. But in this particular case, and I'll probably still bring some variations of this to the channel. So let's say this is version 1. I've got a couple of more in the oven, so to speak. But in this case, I'm using these two weapons, and as you saw, as I've mentioned from the footage, I essentially swap between the two of them, and it doesn't really matter to me which one of the two I have in my hands. I just use that to engage the fortress buff, which gives me additional damage, but also gives me damage mitigation and survivability, which in a solo environment you do need with this build. You are going to be feeling some pressure from enemies when they push you, and so you want to be giving yourself as much survivability as possible. Last but not least, I have a Torment and Agony on here with Kinetic Stomp and Clip Combustion. I never swap to it. This is a gun from another build that's just in my build here, and I essentially only swap between my two primaries. Now, when we get over to the build, the armor itself, as I've mentioned, this is 3-piece Akari, and we're using the head, the chest, and the legs because we want as much anomaly power as possible. The hands and the boots on the Akari set give health, and so therefore they're less preferred for us. As you can see, I'm trying to stack as much anomaly power as possible, so just by default, without any buffs firing on it, we're looking at 207k of anomaly power. Now on the headpiece itself, we have Fire Tsunami, which makes heat wave wider. If you've played Akari and you have this wide heat wave, it's going to feel very weird for you to go back to the normal thin little heat wave. And essentially the point is that you want your heat wave to hit as many enemies as possible, because that powers the whole set bonus of Akari, so it makes sense to have the wider one. So there we go. I have Captain Hunter on here. You can opt to, instead of using Captain Hunter, you can opt for 3 heat waves instead of 2 like I use, and that's definitely a very viable option. In fact, my alternate setup to it is in actual fact that way, and it really depends on your preference. I would say that in co-op situations it makes more sense for you to use Captain Hunter. I would say in solo situations it probably makes more sense to have 3 heat waves. It gives you more versatility with where you throw those heat waves, and it just makes more sense to overall have that damage increase instead of just against captains, elites, and bosses. Now when we get over to the chest piece, this is the reload boost mod for volcanic rounds that I was referring to. What is unique about this is most mods give you anomaly power. This gives you anomaly damage, and that's the big difference here. So once you swap out your gun that had volcanic rounds on it and volcanic rounds goes on to cooldown, then you get this massive 50% anomaly damage increase. Now this is on all anomaly damage that you deal, so this also not only makes your phasers hit really hard, but again, like you probably saw in the footage before, it really makes the heat waves hit hella hard. In fact, for that matter, even the ticks from burn also hit harder than this. And I mean, we can look at the, like, I can dive into the detail of that, but the point is that essentially this is just a massive overall damage. This even makes your melee hits harder. So this is huge. Volcanic rounds, I think the reload boost mod is perhaps maybe a little bit too strong. Please, I'm not asking for any nerfs or anything like that, but this is just so good. If you play Pyromancer and you want to be using a lot of skills, it kind of just makes sense to bring this in because it just makes you deal that much more damage. But in any case, enough about that. The second one on here is Tidal Wave, which gives us our second heat wave. As I've mentioned, there's another one called Ride the Wave, which we can put in, and that gives us 3 heat waves, which you can absolutely use instead of Captain Hunter. Then when we look over at the legs, I've got Anomaly Echo on here, which comes by default on the legs. It's not a great mod, and I would ideally replace it with something else, but because we have to use the pants of the Akari and the other mod on here is not useful to us. I think it's Irradiation Wave, if I'm not mistaken. I think so, but it's shit in any case. So yes, we're stuck with Anomaly Echo. Then I put Burnt Out on here. Burnt Out is a almost auto include mod when you use Heat Wave. This essentially says that stuff that you hit with Heat Wave take 25% more damage, and it's this interaction that allows this to compete and be the same as Captain Hunter essentially, and that's why. So then when we go over to the gloves, we've got Ashen Champion on here, which is a tier 3 mod for Phaser Beam, which inflicts ash on enemies instead of burn. Now each enemy hit by this increases your anomaly power by 20% up to 100% if you hit 5 enemies, which is really easy to do with Phaser Beam. And this is just gonna make your anomaly power, again, here's anomaly power now, be a lot more, which means your follow-up heat waves are gonna hit harder. And also because it lasts for 10 seconds and our cooldowns are lower than 10 seconds on Phaser Beam, it means your next Phaser Beam is also gonna hit harder. We have Bullet Kindling on here because, as I've mentioned, we do more damage to stuff that's burning, and this is important because things that you hit with Heat Wave, they burn. When you use melee, they burn. When you shoot with shell rocks, they burn. So all of those things add burning, and that just means your follow-up abilities are just going to deal more damage. Last but not least, on the boots, we have 2 Phaser Beam mods. We have a Frequent Phaser. Again, like I said, Phaser's our main ability. It's our bread and butter. It's where our big damage comes from. So we want to be using it as much as possible, especially in one rotation of reload boost from volcanic rounds. And so that's why we have a Frequent Phaser in there. Size matters. Now, by default, Phaser Beam, the beam itself is actually quite accurate and quite thin. Once you put size matters on it, it means that you can essentially fire into a group of enemies, and it's actually going to clear out a whole area around it. It actually does make the beam quite a bit, girthier. The other thing that I like about size matters is it creates kind of like a dead zone very close to around your character as well. So if a bunch of enemies are running at you and they're kind of like on your sides and they're hitting you from the side, Phaser's going to hit them as well and take them out. Now, when we get over to the skills, by now I think you figured it out. The point is, like I've mentioned, we have volcanic rounds on here. We have Heat Wave, and we have Phaser Beam. As you can see, when we go back to the gear here, we're trying to obviously stack anomaly power, and then we're trying to stack cooldown reduction wherever we can, and next we're trying to get status power wherever we can. Now, with the 3 legendary pieces, we're not that lucky because we get 1 status power on the head, we get 1 cooldown reduction on the chest, and then we get 1 cooldown reduction on the legs. So unfortunately, there is a way that you can maybe play this with 5 purple pieces where you stack 5 times status power, but then the point is you lose out on the whole heat wave mechanic and the engine that runs with the set bonus of Akari, and that actually makes you do less damage overall. So on our 2 purple pieces, we absolutely stack anomaly power, status power, and cooldown reduction. Super important that you get those on there. Now, as mentioned, going back to the skills, just jumping around a little bit there, I apologize. We have super low cooldowns here, and that's also largely due to how we make our class tree look, which we'll look at next. But the point is, in one rotation of volcanic rounds, we can fire off 4 heat waves and 2 phaser beams before that cools down. Now that means that you're going to be quite on the cooldowns, hitting them the whole time, and sometimes you'll miss your rotation a little bit. But then on the other hand, usually most things don't survive one rotation. So if you prime volcanic round, you shoot it, you swap out the reload boost, you fire your gun a bunch of times to activate fortress, you go heat wave, and you go phaser beam, that tends to murder mostly everything one shot. And anything that survives that gets 2 more heat waves afterwards, and that's usually all she wrote. Now last but not least, we get over to the class tree. As you can see, I'm using some really weird shit here where I'm essentially going half up the middle tree and half up the bottom tree, and that's because the capstones for both of these don't actually directly affect any of the skills that we use. If we look at the bottom one here, this increases explosive skills. We're not using any explosive skills on this build, and there's definitely a version of this build where I swap phaser out for eruption. Keep an eye out for that. That's coming sometime soon, which is kind of cute as well. But definitely phaser is fantastic. So we're not going to push all the way to Grave Ablaze. Next, when we look at the middle tree, and this is obviously the one which will probably be the most discussed, is you can absolutely push middle tree all the way to the capstone and get that additional armor piercing and resistance piercing from magma elemental. And that is actually going to help you a lot, especially in co-op situations where enemies can start resisting your skills and you're able not to push through them. So perhaps we can say that this version that I have it set up here is, in my opinion, better for solo play. And then once you start playing this a lot in co-op, it probably makes a little bit more sense for you to go in middle tree. The other thing is that you could think of ways to capitalize on using resistance piercing as much as possible, because remember, when you ramp up with magma elemental, you're essentially increasing your anomaly power a lot as well. And this can give you a very good effect alongside what you're already getting from something like Akari and what you're getting from, for instance, if we look over here, what you're getting from Ashen Champion. So those can all be great ways for you to stack your damage, more. But in the end, this is what I'm comfortable with right now and how I'm playing it right now in a solo environment. But again, you can't go wrong with going full middle tree. It's absolutely completely viable to play it that way. Now what I'm doing is I'm picking up as much damage as possible to everything that I can hit, but I'm also making a choice to actively pick up nodes where I get more resistance and more armor, which just gives me more survivability because we are playing solo, so we're the sole focus of enemies attacking us. I am going up into Wildfire to get decreased cooldowns. I'm getting some decreased cooldowns over here, and again I'm picking up armor and I'm picking up as much damage resistance as I can. And since we are picking up 3 magma golem nodes here, I do pick up distance flame as well, which just gives me another 7.5% of anomaly damage. And that is for the build in the video. As always, I want to thank you so much for watching, especially if you made it this far. Let me know in the comments down below if you've tinkered with something like this, if you have an interest in seeing an eruption version of this build, and what you would change, which mods you would swap around, how you would build the class tree if you build this. I'm always really interested in to see your own version of this, and especially due to the fact that I'm so obsessed with the Pyromancer, I'm always open to suggestion. But most importantly, I want you to have a fantastic morning, a great afternoon, and a super awesome evening wherever you are in the world. And until next video, fucking cheers.
They want the best of me now, best of me now, best of me now, best of me. They want the best of me now, best of me now, best of me now, best of me. They want the best of me.